coons dressed up like masqueraders, porters up like rude invaders. When they hear them ragtime tune, white folks try to pass for coons on emancipation.
Describe the two poles of formal and folk culture in the debate about black music.
At the end of the 19th century, many leading black intellectuals were all really trying to figure out how to present African Americans as U.S. citizens, right? These are people who have been marginalized by slavery. Now, a social order is developing to re-marginalize them again. And leading figures, especially people like W.B. Du Bois, are trying to come up with ways to represent African American citizenship. For Du Bois, the way to do that would be to prove that African Americans have the capacity, the creativity, to not necessarily create their own music, but to master the European forms, the formal training, sight reading, perfect pitch, playing the notes right, singing in tune, song form, and of course a form of education coming out of this. So African American educators and musical leaders are trying to teach young people to master the European form. So this is a sense of formal music. It really means European music. Music styles and also performative practices influenced and perhaps even mimicking the great artistic traditions of Europe, French, German, and Italian opera and symphony. At the same time, people like Du Bois and other African American music educators recognize that there's a powerful folk form in African American music. African American educators realize that the slave spirituals, the work songs, a wide variety of vocal singing, but also other types of songwriting that African Americans had been developing for generations, mostly during slavery, but also since slavery, that there's a folk tradition that is unique to African Americans. So Du Bois sees both folk music and formal approaches to European music, but now maybe that folk music as an opportunity to create African American artistry and ultimately citizenship. Du Bois is thinking about taking this rough, perhaps spontaneous and not particularly formal folk music of the slave spirituals and dressing them up in European style, European approaches, formalizing this folk music. That's one of Du Bois's ideals. And it's also a good metaphor for Du Bois's own idea of African American citizenship, taking a rough, uneducated people, right? You can't teach slaves to read, it's illegal, right? African Americans, one of the first things they want to do at the end of slavery is to learn to read, to educate themselves and their children. This is one of Du Bois's goals, right? To take this rough folk people and through education, through certain levels of morality, industrial thrift, hard work, to turn these rough folk peoples into modern American citizens. And so Du Bois sees not only the mastery of European classical tradition, but also the arrangement and mastery of European approaches to black folk music as an opportunity for African Americans to work as cultural workers, yes, but also to identify themselves as fundamental American citizens just like everybody else.
How did Clarindi demonstrate the possibilities of a third way?
Well, in 1898, Will Marion Cook, an African-American composer from Washington, D.C., as a young man, he went to Oberlin College, studied formal music. Will Marion Cook was one of the first African-Americans to study music in Europe. He studied in Germany, and he came back from Germany interested in playing opera, in writing music in the grand symphonic tradition that he had just mastered, both studying in America and in Germany. And of course, he found out very quickly that those opportunities were not open to African Americans. Will Marion Cook began writing songs for vaudeville, writing musical theater. And in 1898, Will Marion Cook and also Paul Laurence Dunbar, one of the most celebrated of African-American poets of that era and somebody who's still renowned today, 100 years later, Dunbar and Cook teamed up to write a musical called Clorinda, or The Origin of the Cakewalk. The cakewalk being antebellum era slave dance in which they are mimicking and perhaps making fun of the pretensions of white people's dance, right? So this cakewalk, it's very popular dance for ragtime dances in the 1890s, but it has its roots in slave dance. And of course that interesting interracial cultural creation going back and forth across the color line. So in 1898, when Will Marion Cook and Paul Laurence Dunbar put on their Clorinda, or The Origin of the Cakewalk, on Broadway, it was the first African-American musical on Broadway Avenue. And Broadway Avenue wasn't yet what we associate with the center, the capital of American theater. It was African-American ingenuity and these musical theater performances that really made Broadway Broadway. Clorinda is an interesting example of Will Marion Cook and Paul Laurence Dunbar's response to this idea that black music is either folk or it's formal. Will Marion Cook and Paul Laurence Dunbar chose a third route, the popular route, by being informed by classical music, by being informed by that formal music, but also by incorporating the seemingly folk rhythms of ragtime. Will Marion Cook was staking his claim that African-American popular culture can change black representation, can bring good earning dollars not only to the composers and the performers, but their troops and their families, right? The traveling vaudeville troops. So Clorinda is a very good example of a formally trained African-American composer with all the chops, all the skills of a European composer at the end of the 19th century, but with his own grounding in an African-American folk tradition, forging a third path and really using the commercial marketplace, in this case, Broadway Avenue, but very soon also Tin Pan Alley, as opportunities for African Americans to create a new form of representation, a new form of popular culture.
Time ain't long for our song, mighty sweet to hear, and old darky band sounds so grand, make you feel so queer. Now's the time, get in line, we ain't here to fight. What's the use of abuse? Dogtown is all right.
And there'll be warm coons a-prancing, swell coons a-dancing, tough coons who want to fight. So bring along your blazers, fetch out your razors, Dogtown is out tonight.
Who was the star of Clorinda?
The star of Clorinda happened to be Ernest Hogan, the composer of All Coons Look Alike to Me. Ernest Hogan and Will Marion Cook had met one another at the Hotel Marshall, a very interesting black-owned hotel, also a restaurant and a meeting place among the leading black performers in New York City, although lots of white performers also like to show up and participate, right? But Will Cook and Ernest Hogan and a larger community of African Americans worked together, critiqued one another's work, also debated and argued about the best ways to present African-American culture. They also argued about, like Du Bois, the best ways to promote African-American citizenship. By the time Ernest Hogan is performing in Clorinda in 1898, he's one of the leading stage actors in America. And at this point, he's promoting himself as the unbleached American. And this is a good example of an African American claiming a racial distinction, a African American uniqueness as a promotional tool, as a way to distinguish themselves from white performers, often performing in blackface, but even white folks who are playing ragtime and coon songs without blackface. African Americans are increasingly, during this era, using their race as a distinguishing promotional tool.
Along those lines, describe in brief the career of Williams and Walker, and what role did the coon song play in their success?
Well, Bert Williams and George Walker were undoubtedly some of the most important and influential figures from this era. Williams was actually born in the Bahamas, And for him, he made a point, as an African-American performing in blackface, he made a point in the black press, at least, when people were interested, to note that he wasn't a U.S.-born American Negro, as he put it, that he had to learn and act the part, right, through the kind of minstrel and vaudeville lens. George Walker was from Lawrence, Kansas, and the two of them met roughly 1893 out west, probably California, although it's not exactly clear where they first met. And the two teamed up as a duo, and very early on, they started promoting themselves as the two real coons. And this, of course, was their strategy to intervene in a marketplace dominated by white people wearing blackface, white actors purporting to act as blacks, to sing and dance and tell jokes as African Americans do. Again, the legacy of the minstrel stage. And we see with Williams and Walker very early on in their partnership, their intention to take ownership over that we are the real deal. We are not the counterfeit. We are not the white people pretending to be black. We are real black actors giving you the real black comedy. Now, of course, their comedy is full of stereotypes and caricatures and derogatory and otherwise reprehensible material, but it's a leg up for them. By 1896, Williams and Walker have arrived in New York City. They followed an invitation. George Lear invited Williams and Walker to come to New York to be in one of his stage shows called The Gold Bug, and that ended up not really working out for them. But they stayed in New York nonetheless, and in fact moved into the Hotel Marshall. The Hotel Marshall was one of two black-owned restaurants and hotels in Manhattan at the time. In the 1890s, most African Americans in New York City lived in the Tenderloin district, the 20s to 40s, the west side, modern-day Chelsea and Meatpacking district. And there were a number of black-owned saloons and less desirable places, gambling dens, houses of prostitution, and of course places where ragtime music prevailed. But on West 53rd Street and another area, another neighborhood known as Black Bohemia, there were two thriving black-owned restaurants. One was called the Maceo and one was called the Marshall, both named after the owners. And in 1896, Bert Williams and George Walker moved into the Hotel Marshall. And as they said, they opened their doors to actors of color, to colored actors of all talents, to come be a part of a revolution, of a real opportunity to participate and ultimately challenge and transform American popular culture. And it's through the lens of the Williams and Walker community that they started putting together the Williams and Walker Company. By 1902, between 1896 and 1902, Williams and Walker produce a handful of musical theater plays. They work with Will Marion Cook, the German-educated African-American composer. They work with Bob Cole, another stalwart of black vaudeville touring circuits. But by 1902, Williams and Walker really have their breakthrough. They perform, they compose and write, along with a bunch of other writers at the Hotel Marshall, handful of libretto writers, songwriters, script writers, and also Will Marion Cook, the composer, who wrote a through score for a play called In Dahomey. And In Dahomey is really one of the earliest pieces of musical theater by an all-African-American troupe, the Williams and Walker Company. It's a huge hit. it makes huge waves. It tours the country for over a year. The Williams and Walker Company tour the UK, and in fact do a performance for the royal family at Buckingham Palace. In 1903, George Walker, Bert Williams, and their wives, Ada Overton Walker and Lottie Williams, are cakewalking through the royal gardens, teaching British royalty the most exciting and popular dance in America. Upon their return, Williams and Walker continue their success, and they do 2 more full-scale musical theater performances. In 1906, Williams and Walker put on Abyssinia, which is based in Ethiopia, actually quite a political statement, Ethiopia being the last holdout to the colonization of Africa at the time, and that's really what the play is about, although the play is full of racist comedy and blackface too. And in 1908, the Williams and Walker Company put on Bandana Land, and it's during a national tour of Bandana Land that George Walker becomes ill and is no longer able to perform. Williams and Walker Company lasts roughly from 1902 to 1909, but it has a huge effect on American theater. As Williams and Walker are creating new forms of African American comedy, still performing in blackface, still using coon song lyrics, ragtime rhythms, also speaking in dialect using song lyrics in this colloquial dialect. It doesn't really sound like the way anybody really speaks, but it's this, again, this representation of African American language. These folks are also really transforming what American theater looks like. When they perform Abyssinia in 1906, most of the white critics writing for the New York Times and everywhere else in America say that this play is too white. A very weird criticism to make about an all-black cast staging a musical theater in Africa, right? But what they mean by too white is it's too professional. It's too darn good, right? The singing is wonderful. The dancing is wonderful. Ada Overton Walker, George Walker's wife, is the choreographer for the Williams and Walker Company, a wonderfully creative woman and leader of the dance troupe. And Will Marion Cook's through score, nobody had seen anything like it outside of opera. The huge sets, the exciting costumes and set design, the lighting design. The Williams and Walker Company were innovators in many, many ways for American theater, not just African American vaudeville.
Describe in brief the career of Bob Cole.
Bob Cole is another very important character in this story of coon songs and also in the story of the Hotel Marshall. Bob Cole was at the Hotel Marshall when Williams and Walker arrived, and he helped really create that as a vibrant space for African American creativity. Bob Cole got his start touring the country in a black vaudeville group called the Black Patty Troubadours. And this was focused on Ciceretta Jones, an African-American singer who had a wonderful operatic voice. They called her the Black Patty because she was the African-American equivalent to a well-known Italian opera singer. And Bob Cole worked as an actor, as a writer, as a stage producer for many of Black Patty Troubadour's events. In the late 1890s, he broke off and created his own company. Bob Cole's first musical theater was A Trip to Coontown. In 1898, Bob Cole wrote and produced and performed in a piece of musical theater, a piece of vaudeville that many historians refer to as the first example of African-American musical theater because of a mostly coherent plot, a mostly coherent series of characters and thematic continuity. If you really look at A Trip to Coontown, it was full of contortionist dancers and other types of circus performances, and it looked a lot like a vaudeville show. But nonetheless, it was a hit. And Bob Cole used coon songs, to make it such. The ragtime dances, the ragtime rhythms were all about what Coontown was about. Now, even then, A Trip to Coontown was also criticizing aspects of the new Jim Crow order, of the new forms of white supremacy increasing. He even referenced All Coons Look Alike to Me, the hit song only 2 years earlier. In one of Bob Cole's songs, he says Coontown is the only place where all the coons look alike, right? He's making a joke referencing Ernest Hogan. but also capitalizing on the opportunities of these kind of coon songs, of these kind of racial forms of humor. Interestingly, Bob Cole actually whited up instead of blacking up in shoe polish, as many performers, black and white, did during this era. Bob Cole, an African American, whited up in clown makeup and acted like a white hobo, Willie Waysides, right? So that was also a part of a trip to Coontown. When Bob Cole is hanging out in the Hotel Marshall and working with Williams and Walker, being introduced to Will Marion Cook, with whom he didn't really get along that well. They had a very stormy relationship. But Bob Cole increasingly disavowed the coon song. He wanted to transcend it. He wanted to leave it behind. Bob Cole met with the Johnson brothers. James Weldon Johnson is one of the leading lights of the Harlem Renaissance. Many people know of James Weldon Johnson's collections of African American poetry. He's one of the first to collect black poetry into collections. He wrote a terrific history of black New York called Black Manhattan. He contributed to the New York Age. James Weldon Johnson was a luminary of the Harlem Renaissance. But before that, before the 1920s, James Weldon Johnson and his brother Rosamond Johnson were both writing popular music in New York City. Now, James Weldon Johnson was the literary figure of the two, but his brother was formerly trained at the New England Conservatory in Boston. And so Rosamond Johnson had his own background, formal education, musical education, which, like Will Marion Cook, he could only use in vaudeville. But when the Johnson brothers teamed up with Bob Cole, they really began to transcend the limitations of coon songs. One of the things that they did, as Williams and Walker were creating their own black companies and creating their own great examples of black musical theater, Cole and the Johnson brothers began writing pop songs for white performers. People like Mae Irwin and Sophie Tucker, those coon shouters that had popularized the coon songs in 1896 and 1898. Well, by 1902 and 1903, they are buying and helping promote Cole and Johnson songs. And as Cole and Johnson are getting more and more popular on Tin Pan Alley, they were able to decrease the racism of their songs. They keep the snappy syncopation. They are still thriving on the excitement of the ragtime rhythms, but they are losing parts of the dialect. They are certainly losing increasingly the ugliest and most racist caricatures. All in all, Cole and Johnson don't really ever leave the dialect behind completely. And in fact, Johnson talks quite a bit about that in the 1920s, the limitations that black poets found themselves in. Even Paul Laurence Dunbar recognized as he wrote dialect poetry that it was a limitation foisted upon him due to his race. But Cole and Johnson, as they became more popular, writing Tin Pan Alley hits for white Broadway stars and for white Broadway shows, they were able to write songs about romance, black romance, that wasn't just a joke. It wasn't just the butt of a joke, a clowning, buffoonish. That's really how black romance registered in American theater. But Cole and Johnson began writing songs about black love. They, again, lose the racial stereotypes of razor wielding, of watermelon and chicken thieves. And so Bob Cole is a really great example of somebody who began with one kind of foot in the door of the coon song, but really was able to very much transcend that and also make quite a good living and gain some cultural capital, some social respect in ways that many coon songwriters had difficulty finding.
Talk about the one song from that era that is somewhat remembered today.
Down in a jungle lives a maid of royal blood, though dusty shade. A marked impression once she made upon a Zulu from a taboo. And every evening he would be down underneath the bamboo tree, awaiting there his hope to see, and then to her he'd sing.
Under the Bamboo Tree, yes. I think one of the longest legacies of songs from this era. I don't know how often it's still performed. In 1902, Rosamond Johnson, his brother James Weldon Johnson, and Bob Cole sat down to write a hit song. By this point, they had written a couple hits for Broadway. And they were going to write a new song. And Rosamond Johnson had a clever idea of taking a couple bars from the old slave spiritual, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, and reworking them into a pop song. If you look at the music, or if your ear can catch it, it's a great example of a New England conservatory musical trick. This guy inverted the first two notes and added some rhythmic syncopation, but basically took the recognizable first lines of the slave spiritual and turned it into a pop song. So rather than the African-American dialect that was so important to the coon songs and the ragtime of this era, it's this more imaginative, exotic dialect.
If you like me like I like you, and we like them both the same, I like to say this very day, I like to change your name, 'cause I love you and love you true, and if you will love me, one live as two live as one, under the bamboo tree.
This actually speaks to another really important aspect to African American representation during this era of a real attempt to distance themselves from slavery, even from the great slave culture. Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, is quite unusual in 1903 with really trying to celebrate African American slave spirituals. His wonderful chapter on the sorrow songs in his wonderful book, The Souls of Black Folk, right? It is this fundamental text in American literature, not just Black America, but American literature, that Du Bois is celebrating the slave spirituals, and it offers the slave spirituals as an example of not just Black American culture, but American culture. Right? This idea, again, of formalizing the folk ways, the folk culture of Black America. But Du Bois was really unusual at that point. And Rosamond Johnson felt like his education at New England Conservatory made him want to distance himself from the Black roots of ragtime, from the Black roots of other types of popular music. And that's a much more common tact. Most African Americans during the late 1890s and even the first decade or so of the 20th century wanted to forget, wanted to leave behind not just slavery, but even slave culture that of course would become much more celebrated in the 1920s with the Harlem Renaissance really kind of reviving interest in Black history.
Well, the judge asked me what had I done this morning. Standing in the crap game, getting my gun, my heart stopped. Well, the judge and the jury, they says to me, you done killed 3 niggas in the first degree, and there's no bail. They put me on a board of that Sing Sing train. They loaded me down with a ball and chain. Every station that I passed by, I imagine I could hear my baby cry. Then bye-bye, my honey, if you're gone, my darling. And goodbye, my honey, if you're gone, my baby. Well, it ain't no use for the weeping moan. You've been a good old wagon, but you're badly bent, so bye-bye. Yes, indeed, nigga, you not only been a good old wagon, but you is badly bent and your axle needs greasing. You hear me?
The whole topic's embarrassing. Why should we even be talking about it?
I think when historians, when musicians, when filmmakers are thinking about this topic, we are really walking that same narrow line that many of the subjects of our inquiry were walking. There's a sense of just such overwhelming derogatory racism, such ugliness in the Jim Crow era. Almost all Americans would prefer to forget it. Almost all Americans would like to pat themselves on the back and imagine, to pretend that we've transcended our racial history. But in reality, our racial history lives with us today. right? As Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And we are all today still struggling with the legacies, with the echoes of coon songs, but also the era from which they came. And so, yes, it's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. We should think twice and measure our words. We should listen to people of different colors, of different backgrounds, with different attitudes to get a wide array of viewpoints on coon songs and on ragtime during this era. But ultimately, in order to do justice to American history, to do justice to the legacy of the actors of this story, and really, frankly, to understand the amazing creativity of the 20th century of American popular music that gave us jazz and gospel, blues, rock, funk, soul, and hip hop. In order to understand all of that stuff, not just the beauty and creativity of it, we need to understand the racial paradoxes, the quagmire, and really the inequality and imbalance in American society then and now.
That's beautiful. That's a great thesis statement.